Hello there and welcome back to Language Professora. We are still doing our Jamaican literature text for grade 7, Man from Jamaica's Hills. We are now going into chapter 8. Now chapter 8 is a little bit lengthy, so I'm not going to make the same mistake I made with chapter 2, where chapter 2 was pretty long if you can recall, and I basically split up the different plots but made it into one video. I'm not going to make that mistake because I know that your attention spans are a little bit short, so I'm going to keep it a little bit short. So rather than having one long video, I'm going to have 3 shorter videos that you can bite off in chunks as you go along. So there is going to be 3 videos for chapter 8, just note that. So this is part 1 of the 3 videos for chapter 8. And the title of the overall chapter is Frank Goes to Church. What a thing! Frank Grant, of all people, goes to church. Let us see what antics he gets up to in church. So plot 1. Frank wants Alice to be his girlfriend. So Frank is getting to that age now where he's thinking about relationships and he wants Alice to be his girlfriend. Now, Alice is Deacon Collins's daughter, and the chapter actually started with him saying that he wants to marry her. Now, you know and I know that Frank being Frank, do you really think he's ready for marriage? Anyway, this is our conflict for the first plot in this chapter. He wants to marry Deacon Collins's daughter. Chiselhead, do you remember who Chiselhead really is in terms of his name? Go back through the other chapters and see if you can recall. But Chiselhead tells him that he is too young to get married. And they both agree that maybe the marriage is out of it, but they can at least get her to be his girlfriend. But Frank doesn't really know how to go about doing that. Now, I know you grade 7s, you're maybe 12 going on 13, far younger than Frank is. And some of you may be thinking about, a little, in Jamaican terminology, a little spooky, a little, girlfriend, boyfriend sort of a thing. So let us see how Frank is going to navigate this situation. So they both come up with a plan and say, because Alice is a church girl, she's a deacon's daughter, Frank is going to have to go to church if he wants to get close to Alice. What a little schemer. So right away we know Frank going to church is nothing to do with the Lord, okay? So Frank goes to church and he becomes a member of the Jimmy P's Church of God. Now, one would think that having become a member, he's going to achieve his goal. No, he did not. An entire year passes and he's getting nowhere with Alice. So Frank is now 1 year older than when the chapter started. So he decides that he's going to take things into his own hands and he's going to fast track things. So he decides that if he can find a way to get close to Alice even more, like physically in her space, and what other way to do that than to go into her house? But he can't just pop up at her house to court her like that. He has to find a way to get into the house on a more frequent and possibly permanent nature. So he devises a plan to get Deacon Collins to take him into his home. Now, suspense is introduced here because we as the readers know Frank is up to no good, but Deacon Collins does not know, and so we have this element of suspense popping in. So what he decides to do is he's going to, quote unquote, force his father to throw him out. So if you read the chapter carefully, you'll see where he went home, he gets into a fight with his father, and he says particular things to kind of push the father in a particular direction, and he gets thrown out of the house pretty much. So he goes to Deacon Collins and he tells him the story about ever since he got saved, his father has been giving him a hard time and he has now thrown him out. Deacon Collins falls for the story and takes Frank in. And that's the climax of this particular conflict. Frank and Alice, they get into a relationship. That's our resolution right there. Now remember, when it comes on to conflict, climax, and resolution, you always want to tie your climax back to your conflict, where this climax is surrounding the events that have unfolded with the conflict. And the resolution, you always want to think about the conflict again, because the resolution is what has fixed the problem with the conflict. So the problem with the conflict was Frank wanted a relationship with Alice. The resolution, he gets the relationship with Alice. So always think about your conflict, climax, resolution in that way. What are the other elements in this part 1? We have our characters: Frank, Chiselhead, Mr. Grant, Alice, and Deacon Collins. For the setting, we have it being in Jimmy Peace, and we know it's at least a year because it says so. The theme, love and relationships, and of course, a theme without deception involving Frank would not be possible, right? So deception is there once Frank is in the mix. All right, let's move on to plot 2. Frank and Alice are thrown out of the house. Why? So remember now, at the end of plot 1, Frank and Alice are in a relationship. Now Deacon Collins notices that Alice is getting fat. Here we have our conflict. There's a problem popping up. The other members of the church know, but Deacon Collins is in denial that she is pregnant. You see him going back and forth in his mind to say, is she really, could she really be? He doesn't really think she is. He is having that internal conversation taking place. But everybody else knows, but he is in denial, clearly. He goes to his neighbor, Miss Agnes, and he, tells her that he thinks something is wrong with his daughter. Some suspense is introduced here, because it's almost as if we're anticipating that he's expecting to hear, no man, nothing is wrong with her. Everything is okay. But some suspense is introduced here. And all that Sister Agnes does in her innocence is confirm that Alice is pregnant, and the whole church and the whole community knows about it. They're actually talking and saying, how is it that Deacon Collins could have taken Frank in, and that he was asking for trouble when he did that, and this is the result of taking Frank in. Now Deacon Collins gets upset. He flies into a rage and he says, listen, they can't stay here. They cannot stay here. Why do you think Deacon Collins does not want Frank and Alice to stay more than just her being pregnant? But it's, I'm kind of pushing in a direction for this answer. It's involving the pregnancy, but think about the era again in Jamaica, although we have kind of gotten to the point where we're transitioning into another era. But think about it being a country setting. Think about the fact that Frank and Alice are young. Think about the fact that Deacon Collins is a churchman. Alice is not married to Frank. Think about all of those things as to why you think he wants them out of the house. Frank hears Deacon Collins calling out his name and he knows, okay, there's trouble afoot here. Deacon Collins, of course, tells them to leave, and it's causing a scene in the community. Now, these very quiet villages, there's not much excitement. So at any point in time that you hear anything happening, it's cause for commotion, it's cause for attention. So you can just picture that scene in the community where Deacon Collins is speaking on top of his voice, shouting, more than likely, and people are coming out to watch what is unfolding. Frank and Alice leave the house with Alice in tears, and that's the resolution. So going back to the conflict, Deacon Collins realizes that something is wrong with Alice. Resolution, he realizes that she's pregnant and she has to leave the house, and she leaves with Frank. What are the other elements in this plot? We have our characters: Deacon Collins, Sister Agnes, Frank, Alice, and other community members. I think it's maybe one of the first areas where we don't see Frank popping up as the first character. The setting, of course, is Jimmy P's, and it's over a period of months now. Because a pregnancy doesn't show up in 1 month, 2 months, maybe 4 or 5 months go down the line. And our theme, love, and I have included family relationships, because we can examine love in terms of the relationship between Frank and Alice, and we can examine family relationships in relation to the relationship between Alice and her father. And to round off part 1 of chapter 8, we have plot 3. Frank and Alice go to Spanish Town. So remember now the trajectory that we're on. So Frank and Alice, they leave Deacon Collins's house and they have nowhere to go. So that introduces our conflict right here. Miss Agnes, that's the neighbor down the road. She offers to put them up for the night. And the next morning they head to Spanish Town to find one of Frank's friends, where they want to ask if they can stay there. When Frank pops up with Alice, the friend is very observant and he realizes that they have luggage with them. And he's saying, I hope it's not stay them come to stay, because my house too small. My house can't accommodate anybody to stay. Anywho, the friend realizes that Frank is going around and around and around. And he just comes out and asks him point blank, why are you here? What do you want here? Frank explains the situation and the friend says, we can't accommodate you. So we introduce some suspense here because we're now wondering, okay, if the friend can't accommodate them, what will they do? What is the next step? You understand? So once you're beginning to wonder what's going to happen next, suspense is introduced. The friend says he's going to have to speak to his wife about the situation. So when he calls the wife, she basically tells them the same thing, that the space is not convenient for another couple to be staying there and they just can't accommodate them. But Frank, being Frank, we know he's not going to give up that easily. And so he puts on a pitiful act and it moves the wife to tears. Frank is very convincing when he's ready and he played it to the fullest extent in this scene. And the wife agrees to let them stay. So we have our conflict being resolved. Conflict, they didn't have anywhere to go. Resolution, they now have somewhere to stay. What are the other elements in this section? We have our characters being Frank, Alice, Miss Agnes and her family. Go back to the chapter and pull a description for what Miss Agnes's house looks like. We're told how many rooms, how many beds, I believe how many children, the sleeping arrangements. So do some further reading on that to kind of familiarize yourself with that setting, or with that scene rather. Then in Spanish Town we have Tobal, that's Frank's friend, and we have Tobal's wife, Beverly. The setting starts with Jimmy P's and ends in Spanish Town, and it's over one day, so the night before into the following day. And the theme for this section is friendship. Let's look at a couple questions. Now, I have deliberately set these questions at the critical thinking level because I think by now in chapter 8, our brains are a little bit more mature, a little bit more engaged with the story, and you can begin thinking outside the box. If you don't recall what critical thinking questions are, go back to the chapters 1 to 6 review that I did, where at the end of that video I explained the 3 comprehension levels. So we're going to be doing some critical thinking here. How old do you think Frank is right now? Pull all the information that you have about Frank together and give an estimate, a good range or estimate. And why do you think Chiselhead told him he was too young to get married? So that sort of will kind of give you a gauge as well as to figuring out what you think Frank's age might be. Do you think Frank was ready to have a girlfriend? Again, once I'm asking you what you think, I'm asking for your opinion, right? There may not be an answer in the text itself to say Frank was ready to have a girlfriend because XYZ, or Frank was not ready to have a girlfriend because XYZ. There's nothing there. But I want to know, based on what you have seen of Frank so far, do you as a reader think he was ready to have a girlfriend? And separate and apart from that, generally speaking now, let's pull it into 2024. What do you think? Maybe you're a young lady reading this. Maybe you're a young man reading this. But what do you think a young man needs to have to be in a relationship? What does he need to have physically? What does he need to have emotionally? What does he need to have in terms of a personality? What do you think he needs to have to be in a relationship? And finally, and I kind of hinted at it in the video, why do you think Deacon Collins put Frank and Alice out because she was pregnant? Why do you think he did this? And I phrased this question in particular, adding the last phrase about her being pregnant, because I know that if I didn't add that part, your automatic response would be he put them out because she was pregnant. But I don't want to hear he put them out because she was pregnant. I want you to think about, why would her pregnancy cause him to put them out? Okay? So, in a nutshell, that's the end of part 1 of chapter 8. Happy reading!